The engines went silent at 30,000 feet. 155 passengers heard the terrible quiet and knew they were going to die. The captain searched desperately for anywhere to land. No runway was close enough. Only a freezing river below offered hope, but water landings almost always end in tragedy. Among the terrified passengers sat a woman in farmer's clothes. Nobody knew she possessed the one skill that could save them all. Nobody suspected the quiet rural worker held their survival in her hidden expertise. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Airbus A320 cruised at 32,000 feet through crystalline morning sky, its twin CFM56 engines humming their steady industrial song while Captain Marcus Webb reviewed the descent profile into LaGuardia with the methodical precision that 23 years of commercial aviation had ingrained into his professional routine. The coffee in his insulated cup still steamed beside the throttle quadrant, untouched since departure, as he confirmed vectors with New York approach control through his headset. Flight 1549 carried 155 souls through air so clear and cold that Manhattan's towers stood visible 70 miles ahead, sharp against the winter horizon like promises of safe arrival that seemed absolutely routine on this January morning. His first officer Jennifer Park updated the flight management computer while cabin service began its final preparation for arrival, flight attendants moving through the aisles with practiced efficiency that suggested nothing but ordinary completion of another northbound morning departure from Charlotte Douglas International Airport. The Canada geese appeared without warning at 11,000 feet during their initial descent into the New York terminal area, a massive flock rising from the Hudson Valley wetlands in their winter migration pattern, their formation dense and chaotic as they climbed directly into the aircraft's flight path with the inevitability of collision that neither technology nor pilot's skill could prevent. The aircraft's weather radar showed nothing because birds don't reflect radar energy the way storm cells do, and the traffic collision avoidance system remained silent because geese don't transmit transponder signals. Webb saw them for perhaps 2 seconds before impact, a dark cloud of perhaps 50 large birds rising directly ahead with wings beating frantically as they climbed through the exact altitude corridor the aircraft occupied. His hand moved instinctively toward the throttles in futile defensive gesture as dozens of large birds struck the aircraft's nose, windscreen, wing leading edges, and both engines simultaneously with sounds like sequential explosions that echoed through the cockpit and reverberated through the entire fuselage structure. The left engine ingested at least 4 large geese through its intake cowling, their bodies weighing perhaps 12 pounds each and shredding instantly into the spinning compressor blades with catastrophic results that destroyed the precise tolerances allowing jet engines to function. The titanium and nickel alloy blades, spinning at over 10,000 revolutions per minute, disintegrated upon contact with organic matter traveling at relative velocities exceeding 400 miles per hour. Compressor stages separated from their mounts, turbine sections fractured under imbalanced loads, and the entire engine core essentially destroyed itself within seconds as metal fragments ricocheted through chambers designed for smooth airflow rather than solid projectiles. The right engine suffered identical devastation 1 second later, both power plants experiencing immediate flameout as organic matter converted sophisticated turbofans into dead weight hanging beneath the wings, their combined thrust of 48,000 pounds instantly reduced to zero with no possibility of recovery or restart. Webb felt the aircraft shudder through the control column as both engines went silent simultaneously, their familiar vibration disappearing instantly and leaving only the whistle of wind across the fuselage and the sudden terrible quiet that every pilot dreads. The loss of engine noise created an eerie silence in the cockpit that felt almost supernatural. After hours of constant turbine hum, the absence of that sound triggered primal fear in both pilots who understood immediately that silence meant catastrophe. The cockpit filled with warning tones and automated alerts creating cacophony of alarms, master caution lights illuminating red across the instrument panel while the engine indicating and crew alerting system displayed the catastrophic reality in technical language that translated to simple truth: they were going to crash. The primary flight display showed both engine indicators dropping to zero thrust, the ECAM system cycling through emergency procedures, and multiple warning messages competing for attention on screens designed to help pilots manage emergencies but now simply confirming their worst nightmare. Engine failure both engines, Park announced with professional precision that barely masked the terror in her voice. her hands already moving through the dual-engine failure checklist that every commercial pilot practices in simulators but prays never to execute with actual passengers depending on their skills for survival. The checklist procedures felt inadequate in the face of total thrust loss, relight attempts, fuel system checks, electrical system management, all designed for single-engine failures or situations where at least some thrust remained available. Webb attempted restart procedures with mechanical precision even as his mind calculated what both pilots already understood with sickening clarity. They were flying a 70-ton glider descending at approximately 1,000 feet per minute with perhaps 3 minutes before impact became inevitable and absolutely no thrust available to change their trajectory or extend their range toward any airport. "We're not restarting," Webb said after 30 seconds of futile ignition attempts, his voice steady despite the sweat breaking across his forehead and the adrenaline flooding his system. Both engines showed complete failure with no response to restart procedures, no indication of any internal combustion resuming, no possibility of thrust recovery through any emergency protocol their training provided. They were descending over the most densely populated metropolitan area in North America with both engines dead and 155 people facing certain death unless Webb could find somewhere to put this powerless aircraft down in approximately 3 minutes before altitude ran out completely and physics claimed them with finality that no skill could overcome. Park calculated distances to available airports with desperate speed, her fingers flying across the flight management computer. Teterboro Airport lay within visual range but required altitude they no longer possessed given their descent rate. LaGuardia was mathematically impossible, Newark completely unreachable given their current glide ratio and the inexorable reality of gravity pulling them toward Earth. "We can't make any runway," she announced with the finality of mathematical certainty that allowed no hope. "We have maybe 2 minutes before we're too low for any option." Webb scanned the landscape below with predator intensity, his eyes moving systematically across the suburban sprawl of northern New Jersey where apartment buildings, schools, shopping centers, residential neighborhoods, and industrial complexes created a deadly obstacle field where any landing attempt would kill everyone aboard the aircraft plus countless people on the ground in their homes and businesses. His military training from fighter operations decades earlier kicked in with cold assessment of impossible options: no clear space large enough for emergency landing, no open fields within gliding range, no golf courses or parks sufficiently sized, nothing but buildings and obstacles and populated areas where their descent would create mass casualties and transform aviation emergency into ground disaster. Then he saw the Hudson River running north to south like a silver ribbon through the urban landscape, its winter waters wide and relatively clear of boat traffic on this cold January morning, offering the only possible landing surface within their remaining glide distance. "We're ditching in the Hudson," he announced to Park with decision that allowed no second-guessing or debate. "Begin water landing checklist immediately." The announcement to the cabin came with brutal honesty that commercial aviation rarely employs with passengers who expect reassurance rather than terrifying truth. "This is the captain. Brace for impact. Brace for impact. We're going into the river." The words triggered immediate chaos among 155 passengers who understood with terrible clarity that their routine morning flight had just become a survival scenario that most commercial water landings historically resolved through drowning and fuselage breakup. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with urgent commands delivered in voices that remained professionally controlled despite their own terror, their training overriding their awareness that they were preparing passengers for one of aviation's most dangerous emergency procedures. They demonstrated crash positions with mechanical precision, checked seatbelts with hands that wanted to shake, prepared emergency equipment with minds calculating survival odds, and maintained professional composure while knowing that successful commercial water landings had occurred so rarely in aviation history that each attempt risked catastrophic structural failure on impact. Children began crying with instinctive fear as parents held them close. Businessmen who'd been working on laptops moments earlier now gripped armrests with white knuckles, elderly passengers whispered prayers in various languages while younger travelers frantically typed final messages to loved ones on phones they knew wouldn't transmit. A mother in row 12 held her infant daughter against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she whispered apologies for bringing her child on this flight. Two businessmen in first class who'd been arguing about a contract before the emergency now held hands in silent terror, their previous conflicts meaningless in the face of imminent death. A young couple in row 20 who'd been traveling to New York for their honeymoon embraced each other tightly, the husband whispering, "I love you," repeatedly while his bride sobbed against his shoulder. An elderly man in row 15 pulled out a photograph of his grandchildren, staring at their faces with expression of profound grief at the realization he might never see them again. The cabin filled with sounds of terror barely contained, sobbing, praying, desperate declarations of love into phone recordings, strangled cries of fear that people tried unsuccessfully to suppress, and the mechanical repetition of flight attendants commanding, "Brace, brace, heads down, stay down," with voices that cracked slightly despite their professional training to remain calm during emergencies that would kill them along with their passengers if the ditching failed. Sarah Chen sat in seat 18F maintaining the same quiet composure she'd shown throughout the flight, her weathered hands folded across the simple canvas work jacket that identified her as rural working class, her face showing the deep lines of outdoor labor and sun exposure, and her belongings consisting of a worn duffel bag that suggested agricultural work rather than any professional occupation requiring business attire. Other passengers had barely noticed her during boarding at Charlotte, their eyes sliding past her farmer appearance toward business travelers in suits and tourists in designer clothes who seemed more interesting or worthy of attention. The flight attendant had provided her with standard emergency instructions delivered with slightly louder volume and simpler words as though rural background suggested limited comprehension or education, never imagining that this woman in work boots and faded jeans possessed technical expertise directly relevant to their desperate situation. Sarah's actual background remained completely invisible beneath her deliberate farmer disguise, hidden by conscious choice after military retirement 5 years earlier. She'd spent 12 years as a United States Navy seaplane pilot conducting maritime patrol operations and tactical recovery missions from coastal waters where emergency water landings represented regular training rather than theoretical possibility taught once in simulators. Her naval career had begun at Pensacola with flight training where she'd excelled in water operations that other pilots found challenging, leading to her specialty assignment in P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft and later transition to S-3 Viking carrier-based anti-submarine warfare platforms. Her military specialty had been tactical recovery operations requiring aircraft to land on rivers, coastal inlets, narrow channels, and challenging water surfaces under combat conditions where perfect technique meant survival and any error meant death for her crew. During deployments to the Persian Gulf and Western Pacific, she'd conducted missions that sometimes required emergency landings in hostile waters when mechanical failures or battle damage left her no choice but to ditch rather than attempt reaching distant airfields. She'd executed 17 emergency water landings during her naval career across various hostile environments, 3 in rivers similar to the Hudson, 7 in coastal waters with challenging currents, 4 in open ocean during storms, and 3 during night operations with minimal visibility. She had pioneered ditching procedures specifically designed for narrow water corridors rather than open ocean, procedures that she documented in classified training manuals after near-death experiences taught her what conventional wisdom got wrong about water landings in confined spaces. Her expertise with powerless water landings exceeded what commercial aviation ever taught because her military operations had required mastering exactly this impossible scenario under conditions far more challenging than civilian emergencies. When she heard Webb's announcement about ditching in the Hudson, Sarah's experienced ear caught the subtle changes in engine noise, or rather the absence of it, and recognized through the aircraft's descent angle and the attitude she could feel through her body that the captain was following standard commercial ocean ditching procedures. She understood with absolute clarity born from actual experience that his conventional approach would prove catastrophic for narrow river landing. The descent rate felt wrong to her trained senses, too steep, too fast, optimized for scenarios that didn't match their reality. She could feel through the aircraft's attitude that Webb was setting up for approximately 7-degree nose-down approach, could sense from the deceleration pattern that he was maintaining higher airspeed than optimal for river conditions, could recognize from years of water landing experience that every aspect of his approach was textbook correct for ocean but dangerously wrong for confined waterway. Commercial water landing training assumed vast ocean surfaces with unlimited width and relatively predictable swells, assumed approach angles optimized for open water without concern for lateral boundaries or current effects, assumed impact dynamics completely different from confined river corridors with banks and bridge obstacles and current dynamics that fundamentally changed everything about proper ditching technique. Webb was flying by the book, following procedures that would cause fuselage breakup when the aircraft hit river water at approach angle designed for ocean rather than narrow waterway, with current running south at several knots and with structures creating obstacles that ocean landings never faced. Sarah had seen similar approaches during her military career result in catastrophic failures, aircraft breaking apart on impact, fuselages buckling at pressure bulkheads, wings separating from airframes because pilots applied ocean techniques to river conditions without understanding the critical differences in hydrodynamics and impact forces. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, running mental calculations based on their current altitude, descent rate, and the Hudson River's characteristics she knew from previous flights over this area. The aircraft would hit the water in approximately 90 seconds at their current profile. Webb's approach angle looked to be about 7 degrees nose down, appropriate for ocean ditching where you had unlimited lateral space and wanted to minimize the chance of cartwheeling, but far too steep for a narrow river corridor where excessive descent rate would cause the tail to strike first with force that would buckle the pressure bulkhead and break the fuselage apart. She calculated quickly in her mind, at 7 degrees with their current weight and configuration, impact forces would exceed the fuselage structural limits by approximately 40%, concentrated at the aft pressure bulkhead where the toilet compartments and galley created natural weak points in the airframe. The aircraft would fold like aluminum foil at that stress concentration point, water would flood the cabin instantly through the rupture, and passengers in the rear sections would drown within seconds while those forward might survive only to face hypothermia in January water temperatures. The captain had probably never executed an actual water landing in his entire career, had certainly never landed on a river, and was implementing procedures designed by people who'd never done it either but had created protocols based on theoretical modeling and ocean assumptions that didn't account for current dynamics, lateral boundaries, or the completely different hydrodynamic forces involved in confined waterway impacts. Sarah stood up during final descent with decision born from watching 155 people about to die from well-intentioned but inadequate conventional procedure that would kill them just as surely as doing nothing. She moved forward through the aisle with steady purpose while passengers around her screamed for her to sit down, while nearby travelers grabbed at her jacket trying to pull her back to crash position, while flight attendants rushed toward her with urgent commands to return to her seat immediately. "I'm a former Navy pilot," she announced with calm authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. "I've landed aircraft on rivers multiple times during military operations. Your current approach angle will break the fuselage on impact. I can help you if you let me into the cockpit." The senior flight attendant, a woman named Patricia Morrison with 20 years of experience, hesitated for only a moment as she processed Sarah's words and recognized something in the passenger's voice, some quality of absolute certainty and technical precision that suggested genuine expertise rather than passenger panic or delusional heroism. Morrison made the split-second decision to bring Sarah forward to the cockpit despite every protocol and regulation forbidding passenger access during emergency operations, despite her awareness that she was violating fundamental security procedures, because something in this rural woman's bearing suggested she actually knew what she was talking about. Webb turned in his seat as Sarah entered the cockpit with Morrison behind her, his initial resistance to passenger interference visible in his expression and his hand moving toward the crash axe in defensive instinct until Sarah spoke with technical precision that proved immediate credibility. "Captain, you're approaching at approximately 7 degrees nose down at 140 knots indicated airspeed. That's textbook correct for ocean ditching according to commercial training protocols, but you're landing on a narrow river corridor approximately 3,000 feet wide with current running south at roughly 4 knots. Your descent angle is too steep for confined water, you'll hit hard and the fuselage will buckle at the pressure bulkhead aft of the wings. The aircraft will break in half. You need to flatten your approach to 3 degrees maximum, reduce airspeed to 125 knots using maximum pitch control without stalling, and account for current direction that will push you downstream during touchdown and affect your impact angle. I've done this 17 times in P-3 Orions and S-3 Vikings during tactical seaplane operations. Let me help you." The specific technical knowledge convinced Webb instantly. This woman knew river ditching procedures that commercial training never covered, understood water current dynamics and their effects on impact forces that he'd never considered in 23 years of airline flying, possessed practical expertise with landing powerless aircraft on narrow waterways that exceeded anything his conventional background provided. He made the desperate calculation in perhaps 2 seconds that someone with actual river landing experience represented their only realistic hope for survival against mathematical odds that heavily favored catastrophic failure. "Tell me exactly what to do," Webb said with decision that abandoned protocol and ego for practical necessity. Park stared at both of them with expression mixing terror and desperate hope as this rural farmer in work boots became their emergency flight instructor at 1,500 feet and descending rapidly. "Reduce your descent rate now," Sarah commanded with authority earned through actual experience rather than theoretical training, her voice steady and clear. "Pull back gently on the yoke, use the aircraft's remaining kinetic energy to flatten the glide path. We need 3 degrees nose-down maximum at touchdown, any steeper and the tail will strike first causing the fuselage to buckle and cartwheel. Trade your airspeed for better approach angle but watch your stall margin." Webb complied immediately, pulling the control column back with gentle pressure that converted their forward speed into improved glide angle, feeling the aircraft respond even without engine thrust as aerodynamic forces remained available through control surfaces and the laws of physics still applied to wings and elevators. Sarah watched their descent path with experienced eyes, her mind calculating impact point based on current speed, wind direction from the west at about 10 knots, and river current that would affect where they actually touched down versus where they aimed. "You're approaching the George Washington Bridge," Sarah continued as the massive structure appeared ahead, its steel spans crossing the Hudson with vertical clearance that would allow them to pass underneath if their altitude remained correct. "Use the bridge as your visual reference point. You want to clear it by at least 100 feet to give yourself room to establish final approach attitude. Begin your final flare 50 feet above the water surface, not 30 feet like ocean protocol teaches. The river current creates surface turbulence and unpredictable wind effects near the water that you need extra altitude to compensate for. Keep your wings absolutely level, any bank angle at touchdown will catch a wingtip and will cartwheel and break apart." Webb processed her instructions with the muscle memory of fighter pilot reflexes he hadn't used in decades, his hands implementing her guidance despite every instinct of commercial training that screamed this was wrong, that passengers don't instruct captains during emergencies, that his certification and authority represented qualifications she shouldn't supersede. But Sarah had done this before under conditions where mistakes meant death, had landed powerless aircraft on challenging water surfaces when enemy fire or mechanical failure removed her options, had pioneered and personally tested the exact techniques now required for survival. She understood that river currents created impact dynamics completely different from ocean swells, that narrow water corridors demanded precision that open ocean allowed pilots to ignore, that their survival depended on implementing procedures the commercial world had never developed because commercial aviation rarely required landing on rivers and never trained for it beyond basic theory. "We're at 800 feet, Park announced with voice tight from stress as the Hudson filled their windscreen, its cold January waters rushing toward them with violent speed that made impact seem imminent. Sarah moved beside Webb's seat, her hands hovering near the controls without touching them, her voice providing continuous guidance born from muscle memory and actual practice. "You're doing good, Captain. Maintain this descent rate. Watch your airspeed, 130 knots, you need to bleed off 5 more knots. Use pitch, gentle back pressure. That's it. Keep the wings level, use your ailerons for any correction but keep them minimal." The George Washington Bridge passed overhead with perhaps 200 feet of clearance, its massive structure creating brief turbulence that rocked the aircraft slightly. "Good, we're through the bridge," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline she felt. "Now focus on the water surface. See how it's moving south. That current will try to push us sideways during touchdown. You need to aim slightly upstream of where you want to land to compensate. Start your flare at 50 feet, I'll call it out." Webb could see individual whitecaps on the Hudson now, could see the cold gray-green water rushing past below them at what seemed like impossible speed. His hands gripped the yoke with pressure that made his knuckles white, every fiber of his being focused on maintaining the approach angle Sarah had specified. He could see the Jersey shoreline to his left with buildings rising from the waterfront, could see the Manhattan skyline to his right with thousands of office windows where people worked completely unaware that an airliner was about to attempt landing on the river outside their windows. Beside him, Park called out altitude readings from the radar altimeter with mechanical precision, 300 feet, 250, 200. Her voice remained steady, but Webb could hear the tension underneath, could sense her own terror barely controlled as they descended toward water impact that might kill them all despite Sarah's guidance. "You're at 100 feet, Sarah said, her voice cutting through clearly. "Maintain this attitude. Don't change anything yet. 90 feet, 80 feet, 70 feet, 60 feet, now begin your flare. Pull back steadily, increase your pitch angle, bring the nose up. That's it. Keep pulling. More. Lift that nose. You want the tail to touch first but gently, you're trying to kiss the water, not slam it." Webb pulled the yoke back with steady pressure as they descended through 50 feet, through 40 feet with Sarah commanding, "Keep pulling," more back pressure, through 30 feet as he increased pitch angle against every instinct that said he was about to stall. "Use your pitch control to control descent rate right up to impact," Sarah continued. "The aircraft will want to drop the nose when we hit, fight that instinct hard and keep pulling back. Don't let the nose drop or we'll submarine and break apart." The tail touched first at approximately 20 feet above water at an indicated airspeed of 127 knots, contacting the river surface with impact that shuddered through the entire fuselage with violence that seemed catastrophic. Webb felt the aircraft trying to pitch forward as hydrodynamic forces grabbed the tail, felt the nose wanting to drop into the water with force that would submarine them, and he pulled back on the yoke with every ounce of strength he possessed, fighting the aircraft's natural tendency to bury its nose. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, "Keep pulling. Don't let that nose drop. Fight it." The fuselage settled onto the Hudson with sequential impacts, tail first, then aft fuselage, then center section, then forward fuselage, each contact point distributing impact forces across the entire aircraft length rather than concentrating stress at single failure points that would cause structural breakup. Water exploded across the windscreen with force that seemed like hitting concrete, spray erupting 50 feet into the air as the aircraft decelerated from 127 knots to near zero in less than 10 seconds. The fuselage flexed and groaned under forces it was never designed to withstand, stress radiating through aluminum skin and composite structures, but the pressure hull remained intact. The wings stayed attached despite hydrodynamic loads that would have torn a steeper landing apart at the wing roots. The aircraft settled onto the water surface rather than breaking into pieces because Sarah's military techniques had optimized the landing for river conditions rather than open ocean. The sudden silence after impact felt almost supernatural, no engine noise, no wind whistle, no warning alarms, just the gentle lapping of river water against aluminum skin that had somehow survived the impossible and the sound of passengers gasping in disbelief that they were still alive. "Emergency evacuation," Webb commanded with voice that cracked slightly from adrenaline release and the overwhelming realization that they'd actually done it. "Everyone out now. Inflate life vests. Move to the exits." Flight attendants deployed emergency exits with practiced efficiency despite their shaking hands, inflatable slides extending from doors while passengers scrambled out of their seats with desperate urgency. The overwing exits opened and passengers began climbing out onto the wings, their feet sliding on wet metal as they struggled to maintain balance. The aircraft floated in the Hudson Current with surprising stability, drifting slowly downstream at perhaps 3 knots while 155 people escaped through every available opening. Cold January air rushed through the open doors bringing wind chill that cut through clothing instantly, but nobody cared about comfort when survival meant getting out of the aircraft before it sank. Morrison and the other flight attendants worked with extraordinary efficiency, pushing passengers toward exits, helping elderly travelers through emergency openings, carrying small children, checking rows to ensure nobody remained trapped or unconscious. Doreen Welsh, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience, moved through the cabin with practiced calm despite the chaos, helping a disabled passenger in a wheelchair navigate toward an exit while water began seeping through the forward cargo door seals. Another attendant, Michael Rivera, had broken his wrist during the impact when he'd been thrown against a galley cart, but he continued working with one hand, using his body to physically push passengers through exits when they froze in panic. The water landing had been violent enough to cause injuries throughout the cabin, several passengers showed bloody faces from hitting seat backs despite brace position, a teenage boy had bitten through his lip from the impact force, others held arms that appeared broken or dislocated, one elderly woman had suffered a severe gash across her forehead that bled profusely, and a middle-aged man appeared to have suffered severe whiplash that left him barely able to move his neck, but everyone was conscious and mobile enough to evacuate. Within 2 minutes of touchdown, passengers covered both wings standing shoulder to shoulder in freezing January air, their breath visible in clouds as they shivered violently while waiting for rescue. Some passengers had lost shoes during the evacuation and stood barefoot on wet metal wings, their feet already going numb from cold. Others had grabbed coats and bags despite instructions to leave everything, clutching belongings that suddenly seemed trivial compared to survival. Inflatable slides deployed from forward and aft doors filled with people sliding down into life rafts or directly into the freezing Hudson water where life vests kept them afloat despite the 40-degree water temperature that would cause hypothermia within minutes of immersion. Ferry boats and emergency response vessels converged on the scene with remarkable speed, their crews having witnessed the water landing and responded immediately. The captains of New York waterway ferries diverted from their normal routes, pushing their vessels directly toward the floating aircraft while passengers still evacuated. Thomas Sullivan, captain of the ferry Thomas Jefferson, had been approaching his Weehawken terminal when he saw the aircraft descending toward the Hudson. He'd immediately diverted course and pushed his engines to maximum power, arriving at the scene within 3 minutes of touchdown. Other ferry captains followed his lead, the Moira Smith, the Governor Thomas H. Keene, and the Yogi Berra all converged on the aircraft from different directions, their crews preparing rescue equipment even before reaching the crash site. Private boats and Coast Guard vessels arrived within minutes, their crews shocked to discover successful water landing with apparently zero fatalities, with intact aircraft floating calmly in midstream rather than the submerged wreckage they'd expected, with passengers standing on wings awaiting rescue rather than drowning in submerged fuselage sections. First responders expected mass casualties and underwater rescue operations, instead found disciplined evacuation and shivering survivors who seemed almost bewildered by their continued existence. The aircraft began settling lower in the water as river current penetrated through the unsealed belly and water slowly flooded the cargo holds, but the process occurred slowly enough that everyone reached rescue vessels before submersion became dangerous. Webb stood on the slowly sinking wing helping the last passengers into rescue boats, physically lifting elderly women across the gap between wing and boat hull, his uniform soaked and his hands numb from cold but his mind focused entirely on ensuring everyone got off safely. His eyes searched for the rural woman who'd guided their landing, finally spotting Sarah waiting quietly near the tail section, her farmer clothes completely soaked and her expression showing none of the heroism she'd demonstrated in the cockpit. "You saved everyone," Webb said as he reached her, his voice thick with emotion that professional composure couldn't contain. "Your river landing expertise, without that knowledge we'd have broken apart on impact. I was flying the approach completely wrong. Who are you really?" Sarah met his eyes with quiet dignity that suggested she'd answered similar questions before and found the attention uncomfortable. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, retired. United States Navy, Maritime Patrol Aviation, P-3 Orion and S-3 Viking Tactical Operations, Seaplane Qualification, Tactical Recovery Specialist. I did 12 years landing aircraft on challenging water surfaces during maritime patrol missions and special operations support. After I retired I bought a farm in upstate New York because I wanted quiet life away from military operations and the pressure of missions where people's lives depend on your decisions every single day. I was heading home from visiting my sister in Charlotte. I never intended to be here or to get involved, but I couldn't sit there watching conventional procedures kill everyone when I knew better techniques existed." Webb helped her into the rescue boat, both of them shivering violently now as hypothermia began setting in from the freezing January air and wet clothing. Around them, 155 people floated in the Hudson or stood in rescue vessels, every single person alive because a farmer in work boots had possessed military expertise that exceeded commercial pilot training. The aircraft finally disappeared beneath the surface 24 minutes after touchdown, its fuselage settling into the Hudson's silt while investigators would later marvel that structural integrity had been maintained throughout the ditching and evacuation. The media firestorm began within hours as investigators pieced together the miracle on the Hudson and discovered that passenger guidance had prevented the disaster that dual-engine failure should have caused. Within 24 hours, every major news network had reporters trying to locate and interview Sarah Chen, the mysterious farmer pilot whose intervention had saved 155 lives. CNN, Fox News, NBC, ABC, and CBS all ran extensive coverage analyzing the emergency and featuring interviews with passengers who described the rural woman who'd walked calmly to the cockpit during their descent and guided the captain through procedures he'd never learned. Aviation safety boards wanted detailed technical debriefs about Sarah's river landing procedures that exceeded commercial training protocols and existed only in classified military seaplane manuals. The Federal Aviation Administration requested she participate in developing new training protocols for water landings on confined waterways. NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System wanted comprehensive documentation of her techniques for their research database. News networks wanted interviews with the farmer pilot whose hidden background had emerged during crisis to save 155 lives through expertise nobody knew she possessed until catastrophe demanded intervention. Passengers who dismissed her based on rural appearance expressed shock and embarrassment discovering the quiet woman in work clothes held military aviation qualifications that proved absolutely essential for their survival. David Sanderson, a Wall Street banker who'd been sitting 3 rows behind Sarah, gave an emotional interview to CNN where he admitted he'd barely noticed her during boarding, had assumed based on her appearance that she was probably traveling to visit family or returning from farm work, had never imagined this rural woman possessed expertise that would save his life. "I judged her completely wrong," Sanderson said with visible emotion during the interview. "I made assumptions based on how she looked, what she wore, and I was completely wrong. She's the reason I'm alive to see my kids again. She's the reason any of us survived." Maria Gonzalez, a teacher from Charlotte who'd been traveling with her young son, described how she'd actually felt slightly uncomfortable sitting near Sarah before the emergency because of unconscious class prejudices she hadn't realized she carried. "I'm ashamed to admit I thought she looked rough, like she probably didn't have much education," Gonzalez said tearfully during a television interview. "Then she saved everyone's life including my son's through knowledge and expertise I could never have imagined. She taught me never to judge people based on appearance or occupation. The most important person on that plane was the one I dismissed without even thinking about it." The National Transportation Safety Board investigation lasted 6 months and documented every detail of the emergency with forensic precision, interviewing all 155 passengers and crew multiple times, analyzing flight data recorder information, examining every component of the recovered aircraft, and reconstructing the entire sequence of events from bird strike through evacuation. Investigators used computer simulations to model what would have occurred if Webb had maintained standard ocean ditching procedures without Sarah's intervention. The models consistently predicted catastrophic fuselage failure with survival rates below 20% and most deaths occurring from structural breakup rather than drowning. The NTSB's final report, published as a comprehensive document exceeding 300 pages, noted that conventional commercial ditching procedures would likely have caused catastrophic structural failure during narrow river landing, that Lieutenant Commander Chen's tactical seaplane expertise provided specialized knowledge unavailable through standard commercial pilot certification, that her real-time guidance during final approach represented intervention that saved lives through military experience existing outside commercial aviation's institutional knowledge base. The report specifically commended her decision to intervene despite passenger status and potential consequences, noting that her actions demonstrated extraordinary courage in addition to technical expertise. The NTSB recommended incorporating her river landing techniques into commercial pilot training for the rare circumstances where water landing might occur on confined waterways rather than open ocean, and several major airlines subsequently modified their emergency procedures manuals to include the guidance she provided. The FAA issued a special airworthiness information bulletin incorporating lessons learned from Flight 1549, and Sarah was invited to contribute to the Technical Advisory Committee developing new standards for water landing training across the commercial aviation industry. Captain Webb visited Sarah's farm 3 months later during spring planting season, driving upstate through rural landscape that seemed impossibly distant from Hudson River emergency operations and New York media attention. The drive took him through small towns and agricultural areas where life moved at different pace than the aviation world he inhabited, where people worked with soil and seasons rather than flight schedules and emergency procedures. He found her working in fields wearing the same simple clothes she'd worn during the flight, her hands dirty from soil rather than cockpit controls, her face showing contentment with physical labor that required no technical expertise or life-or-death decisions. Plowing neat furrows across a field that would be planted with corn in coming weeks, her movements practiced and efficient in ways that suggested she'd fully embraced this rural life. When she saw his car approaching down the dirt road, she shut down the tractor and climbed down, wiping her hands on her jeans as she walked over to greet him. "I wanted to thank you properly," Webb said, feeling awkward expressing gratitude to someone who possessed authority during crisis that his captain rank and 2 decades of experience couldn't match. "You knew things I'd never learned in 23 years of flying. Your military background gave you expertise that saved my passengers and my crew and me. I'd have killed everyone following proper procedures. The NTSB simulations showed we had less than 20% survival probability with standard approach. You changed those odds to 100%. Sarah leaned on her shovel regarding him with expression mixing warmth and something like resignation about being drawn back into a tension she'd deliberately left behind. "I left military aviation because I wanted civilian life without emergencies and life-or-death decisions and constant pressure of operations where mistakes kill people and where you carry that weight every single day. I chose farming because it's peaceful and predictable and doesn't require expertise that textbooks don't teach or knowledge that you can only gain through actually doing impossible things under conditions where failure means death. But sometimes situations arise that need specific knowledge, that demand intervention from whoever possesses relevant experience regardless of their current occupation or how people judge them based on appearance rather than background or capabilities they can't see." Webb understood what she meant. That expertise exists in unexpected places, that military veterans often choose anonymous civilian careers after distinguished service, that the most qualified person sometimes appears least likely based on superficial assessment. Sarah had mastered river ditching through actual practice that commercial aviation never required, had developed techniques for narrow waterway landings that standard training didn't address because commercial pilots weren't expected to ever need them, had carried specialized knowledge into retirement that proved essential when catastrophic emergency demanded exactly her specific capabilities. She'd saved 155 lives not through luck or instinct or divine intervention but through professional expertise earned during military career that her farmer appearance completely concealed from judgment of people who saw work clothes and rural occupation and assumed limited education or relevant knowledge. The aviation community eventually recognized Sarah's contribution through various awards and recognition that she accepted with visible discomfort, preferring rural anonymity to public acknowledgement or celebration. Commercial pilot training programs incorporated modified versions of her river landing techniques into emergency procedures, recognizing that her military seaplane experience had identified critical gaps in conventional water ditching protocols that assumed ocean conditions rather than confined waterway realities. Aviation safety experts acknowledged that successful outcome of Flight 1549 resulted from unlikely convergence of catastrophic emergency and hidden expert whose presence aboard represented statistical improbability that proved essential for survival when conventional knowledge proved inadequate. Sarah returned to her farm and her chosen peaceful existence, declining most interview requests and avoiding media attention despite public fascination with her story. But passengers from Flight 1549 never forgot the rural woman whose military background had emerged during crisis to guide impossible landing through expertise nobody suspected she possessed until disaster demanded intervention. They'd learned through terrifying experience that some situations require knowledge existing outside conventional training, that military veterans carry specialized capabilities into civilian life, that the person appearing least qualified based on current occupation might possess exactly the hidden expertise that crisis demands when conventional solutions prove insufficient. Webb kept a photograph of the Hudson ditching in his cockpit for the remainder of his career, a visual reminder that sometimes the right person appears in unexpected form, that judgment based on appearance misses capabilities beneath surface presentation, and that in aviation's most desperate emergencies, survival sometimes depends on recognizing expertise regardless of who possesses it or how unlikely their intervention seems based on superficial assessment of their ordinary appearance. He also kept Sarah's contact information and called her occasionally with questions about water landing procedures, gradually developing friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how close they'd come to complete disaster. The aircraft itself was eventually recovered from the Hudson in a complex salvage operation that required specialized equipment and took several weeks to complete. Divers worked in zero-visibility conditions securing lifting cables to the submerged fuselage while engineers calculated weight distribution to prevent structural damage during the lift. When the aircraft finally emerged from the river covered in silt and debris, investigators photographed every inch of the fuselage, documenting the remarkable preservation of structural integrity despite the violent water landing. The aircraft was transported to the Carolinas Aviation Museum, where it became a centerpiece exhibit, carefully preserved with all the damage from the bird strikes and water landing visible for visitors to examine. The museum created an extensive display explaining the emergency in technical detail, with video animations showing the descent profile, audio recordings of cockpit communications and air traffic control, and personal testimonies from passengers describing their experience. The exhibit includes the actual life vests worn by passengers, pieces of the birds that struck the engines preserved for educational purposes, and detailed technical explanations of how Sarah's river landing techniques differed from conventional ocean ditching procedures and why those differences proved crucial for survival. Visitors reading the detailed account learn about dual-engine failure and impossible descent and narrow river corridor that created conditions where conventional procedures proved inadequate. But the museum display emphasizes Sarah Chen's role, the passenger farmer whose hidden military expertise provided specialized knowledge that transformed certain disaster into miracle survival through techniques existing outside commercial aviation's institutional understanding, proving that sometimes the most critical qualification is the one nobody knows exists until crisis reveals hidden capabilities that save lives through experience earned far from conventional paths and carried quietly into civilian existence by veterans who choose peaceful anonymity over public recognition of extraordinary specialized expertise that emerges only when catastrophe demands exactly what they alone can provide.